Emma's connecting flight was delayed until morning, leaving her stranded in a nearly deserted airport well past midnight. The once bustling terminal had quieted down, and only a few passengers slouched in chairs, some sleeping, others staring at their phones. Emma found herself drawn toward Gate 17, an area marked by a flickering, dim light that cast ghostly shadows across the floor. It looked strange, almost isolated, as if the rest of the terminal had been built around it. She chose a seat by the gate, looking for somewhere quiet to pass the time, and noticed an elderly man sitting a few seats away. He was dressed in a dark, old-fashioned suit, holding a battered leather suitcase on his lap. He caught her eye, offering a polite nod and a faint smile. Emma, feeling a bit uneasy, but grateful for company, smiled back and started a casual conversation. The man seemed kind, though his manner was strangely distant. When she asked where he was headed, he replied, "Home, at last." His tone was heavy, filled with a bittersweet nostalgia. They spoke for a while, Emma trying to brush off her growing sense of unease. The man mentioned he'd been trying to catch his flight for decades, which she assumed was just his way of exaggerating his long wait. Just then, a voice over the intercom announced, "Final boarding call for Gate 17. Emma looked up in surprise. There hadn't been any flight scheduled from that gate all night. When she turned back, the elderly man had already risen, gesturing for her to follow. Unsure, Emma stood and watched as he slowly walked down the jet bridge, his footsteps echoing in the silent terminal. Just as he reached the end, he looked back and nodded one last time before disappearing from sight. Emma hesitated, then took a step toward the gate herself, but before she could take another, a security guard appeared, stopping her. "Miss, that gate's been closed for years," he said with a concerned frown. "It's not in use anymore." Emma, too stunned to respond, pointed toward the jet bridge, but it was now completely dark and empty. She stammered, explaining she had seen a man board a plane, but the guard shook his head. When she asked him about the elderly man, the guard's face turned pale. He explained that Gate 17 had been the site of a tragic accident decades ago, where a flight bound for a small town had crashed shortly after takeoff, with no survivors. Since then, passengers and staff occasionally reported seeing a man sitting by the gate, waiting for a flight that never left. Emma was horrified. Her mind spun as she tried to reconcile what she'd seen. She left the gate and spent the rest of the night in the main terminal, surrounded by people. When her flight finally boarded the next morning, she glanced back toward Gate 17 one last time. It looked deserted, the lights dim and flickering, but she felt certain she could see the faint outline of the elderly man's figure, waiting patiently for a journey that would never come. As she took her seat on the plane, Emma shivered, hoping that Gate 17 would remain in her past. Yet a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that someday, she might find herself at that gate again, drawn back by the mystery of the man and the ghostly final boarding call. After hours of delay, Jacob resigned himself to spending the night in the dimly lit airport lounge. He found a quiet corner, surrounded by empty chairs and tired travelers stretched out in makeshift beds. The silence weighed heavily, with only the occasional hum of the air conditioning breaking the stillness. Jacob closed his eyes, hoping he could catch a few hours of sleep. He drifted off, but was startled awake by a gentle tap on his shoulder. Groggy, he opened his eyes and looked up to see a man standing over him, dressed in an old-fashioned pilot's uniform. The man's face was partially shadowed, but his eyes looked intense, fixed on Jacob with an almost pleading expression. He asked Jacob if he had seen the plane. Jacob blinked, confused and barely awake. He shook his head and mumbled a no, wondering if he was dreaming. The man sighed, a look of sadness crossing his face. He straightened his uniform, nodded curtly, and turned away, walking down the hallway with a steady, purposeful stride. Jacob watched, still half dazed, as the man disappeared into the darkness beyond the lounge. The encounter felt surreal, but Jacob tried to brush it off as a dream. He settled back into his seat, though sleep seemed impossible now. His mind wandered to the pilot, and he couldn't shake the man's intense gaze from his memory. Hours passed, and eventually, morning light began to seep through the terminal windows, the lounge filled with the noise of travelers and staff preparing for the day. Curiosity gnawed at Jacob. He approached a lounge attendant, casually asking if anyone had reported seeing a pilot walking around. The attendant's face immediately grew serious, and she leaned in, her voice low. She explained that, years ago, a flight had disappeared over the ocean, its pilot never found. Since then, there had been sporadic sightings of a man fitting that pilot's description, asking late-night travelers if they'd seen the plane. Jacob felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had assumed it was just a strange dream, but the attendant's story made him question everything. He glanced back toward the corner where he'd seen the pilot disappear, half expecting to see him reappear in the shadows. But the hallway was empty, filled with nothing but the soft murmur of the waking terminal. As he boarded his own flight, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out in the clouds, that lost pilot was still searching, forever waiting for the plane that had vanished with him on board. Mara's overnight layover stretched into the early morning hours after multiple delays left her stranded in the near-deserted airport. Tired of pacing, she found a quiet spot near Gate 22, intending to wait until dawn. As the hours were on, she noticed a small group of people gathering nearby, looking weary but oddly calm. Curious, she glanced at the gate display, surprised to see the flight number read Flight 303. She didn't remember seeing it on the departure board earlier. She assumed it was a newly scheduled flight, and asked an older woman nearby where it was heading. The woman smiled, saying it was bound for someplace far from here, then invited Mara to join them. Feeling strangely drawn, Mara sat down, watching the gate as people boarded slowly, one by one. The gate agent looked pale, almost translucent, but she continued to check tickets, glancing at Mara with a soft, inviting smile. Mara felt an odd sense of calm, as if she were being lulled into a dream, and soon found herself considering boarding with them. But something in her resisted, and she turned her gaze to the gate's display screen. Her heart skipped as she read the message. Flight 303 departed. She looked back at the passengers, who all seemed to blur and fade, their faces hollow and eyes vacant, as if they were fading into shadows themselves. Terrified, Mara jumped up and backed away, her heart racing. A janitor approached, looking concerned, and asked if she was all right. She pointed toward the gate, stammering about Flight 303, but the janitor frowned and told her that the flight had crashed years ago, taking all its passengers with it. Since then, some people swore they'd seen passengers boarding that very gate, still seeking their final destination. Mara's hands shook as she tried to process what she'd seen. She backed away from the gate, feeling as though she'd narrowly escaped something she couldn't understand. She spent the rest of the night near the main terminal, surrounded by as many people as possible. When her own flight finally boarded, Mara hesitated before stepping on, feeling the weight of the night's events heavy on her mind. She glanced back one last time at Gate 22, half expecting to see ghostly figures still waiting there, lost in time and forever bound to a flight that would never leave.